before. He is the executive director of an NGO on sexual minorities of Uganda, and he'll be in conversation with Chicago activist Jane Sachs. And then on Wednesday, May 17th, we wanted to make sure we announced it since we've got a lot of University of Chicago friends in the audience. We'll be welcoming Austin Goolsbee, who will be in conversation with Douglas Holtz-Eakin, with Phil Levy, our own senior fellow on the global economy. It should be a lively conversation about the global economy under the Trump administration. Now back to tonight's program. As many of you know, for nearly a century, the Council has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement with the world. The note is that views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Now briefly introduce our speakers. Tom Ginsberg is the Leo Spitz Professor of International Law at the University of Chicago, and he co-directs the Comparative Constitutions Project, an effort to gather and analyze the constitutions of all independent nation-states since 1789. We're welcoming back to the Council Jeff Stone. He is the Edward H. Levy Distinguished Service Professor of Law at the University of Chicago and one of the nation's leading, somebody didn't follow instructions. One of the nation's leading constitutional scholars. His new book, Sex and the Constitution, is available for purchase and signing from the bookseller after the program. And I just heard Jeff speak at the University of Chicago Women's Board last week. Fascinating, fascinating history that he writes about these issues and the Constitution, and even back beyond the U.S. Constitution. Terrific. I commend the book highly. And our moderator tonight is Christy Hefner. Christy was chairman and CEO of Playboy Enterprises from 1988 to 2008, and she has been involved in First Amendment battles with the Moral Majority, the Meese Commission, and Congress. We're delighted to have her. Please join me in welcoming all of them to the stage. We welcome a lively discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and even thanks to all of you for coming out. I am honored and delighted to be on the stage with these two distinguished Chicagoans to talk about an issue that is not only timely, but fun. So I'm going to start by asking Jeff to speak to us, because the point of departure for this panel was really the book that hopefully all of you will buy this evening. And I know that Jeff worked on this book for over a decade, and yet it seems to me that it couldn't have been published at a more significant time. When you think about the tensions between moral and legal issues as they relate to sex in America. So tell us, what were the questions that you wanted to answer when you were first thinking about writing this book?
Well, this was a curiosity-driven project. Normally, when an academic writes a book, you've thought about this for a long time, you've written articles about it, you even talks about it, you've taught a course maybe about it. In this case, the origins of this were really just my noting the obvious fact that the Supreme Court over the last 60 years has gotten involved in a range of issues relating to sexual matters, from obscenity to contraception to abortion to gay rights to same-sex marriage and so on. And I sort of wondered, what would the framers have thought about this? I knew nothing much about this. My sort of naive assumption was that the traditional attitudes about sexuality throughout American history were more or less similar to the views of the 1950s, and that we'd seen the sexual revolution in the 1960s, and that it triggered all of this really radical transformation. And so I went back and started reading about the framers. What I discovered was much more surprising and interesting than I had anticipated. And that led me to be even more curious about what had led them to the attitudes they had about sex, and began working backwards in time until I ultimately went to the Greeks and the Romans to figure out what their attitudes were, and then work sort of forward over the next 2 millennia. And then I was very curious about how things had changed from the time of the founding of the country to the present. And so then worked forward from the late 18th century to the present, and traced all of the various ups and downs. And it turns out the story, for me, was utterly fascinating. Just to give a simple example, most people don't know that at the time the Constitution was adopted, there were no laws prohibiting abortion, there were no laws prohibiting obscenity. The framers of the Constitution lived in a world of the Enlightenment, but beyond that, there had never been any laws in Western history prohibiting, for example, obscenity or abortion.
So much for originalism, just saying.
Yes, right. So anyway, and so all of that sort of really I found extremely interesting, and so this is a sort of long historical inquiry into how things changed, why they changed, and particularly because of the importance of the role of religion in all of this. The book focuses on how religious attitudes developed over time, and then how they wound up capturing the secular law, and how what's happened in the last 60 years in the United States has been mostly a process of social movements and the judiciary essentially trying to bring us out from under the domination of religious attitudes about sex. And that's obviously an ongoing battle that continues.
So those are all the points that we want to explore, both in the context of the United States and also in the context of constitutions and legal and attitudinal structures internationally. But in the same way, Jeff, that you were saying that there were these prohibitions in the Constitution, there also isn't in the Constitution any right to sexual freedom. So let's talk a little bit first from the American perspective, and then, Tom, I want to turn to you. How do rights get into a Constitution?
So one of the, as you know, the original Constitution did not include a Bill of Rights. That's why they're called amendments, right? And one of the reasons why the original framers of the Constitution did not include a Bill of Rights was because they were concerned that if they listed a series of rights, that those rights would be taken to be exhaustive, and that there would be no other rights recognized, right? And this was a reason not to list rights, because it would imply something that they did not wish to imply. But when it turned out there was a lot of pushback to the absence of a Bill of Rights during the ratification process, they decided to add the Bill of Rights and to guarantee expressly things like the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures, freedom from cruel and unusual punishment, and so on. But to address this particular problem, James Madison drafted what became the Ninth Amendment. And the Ninth Amendment provided that the enumeration of rights in the Constitution shall not be taken to deny or to disparage other rights retained by the people. And it was basically a recognition of the fact that the listing of certain rights did not, in fact, mean that there were not other rights that had to be recognized and protected. To some extent, the framers knew that there were rights they took for granted that had never been really threatened before, so it didn't even occur to them to list them explicitly in the Constitution. And the other thing they realized is that as society evolved, and as we came to have greater knowledge over the decades and ultimately centuries, that our understanding of what fundamental rights were would also evolve, and that was an appropriate thing for the interpretation of the Constitution to embrace. And so many of the decisions in dealing with issues of sexual freedom derive from this idea that there are these unenumerated fundamental rights that the Constitution is meant to protect, even if it doesn't explicitly identify them.
Like a right to privacy.
Like a right to privacy, for example, or a right to marry. This is obviously what leads ultimately to a right to contraception and to a right to abortion and to a right to same-sex marriage.
So, given that we are living increasingly in an interconnected world, and I think that that is reflected even in issues of law and jurisprudence, although there is a debate on the US Supreme Court about how much we should pay attention to other countries' legal precedents. But Tom, I think it'd be interesting to hear, given that we are the longest extant constitutional democracy, how influential has our Constitution been on other countries, and how is that process of actually drafting or evolving constitutions internationally playing out as compared to how we think about it here?
Right. Well, I think it's a great question, and too often we as Americans think that, what we're doing no one else has ever done, and the way we're approaching the issues is the best way to do it. But when you look at particularly these issues, they're live issues in every advanced industrial society, and a lot of times those are developments that move in parallel, but oftentimes there's also dialogue across different constitutional orders, as comes up in some of the case law that's discussed in the book. So the United States, of course, is the first constitution in the modern era and the most enduring. And what's happened over time is that other countries draft constitutions. They tend not to last very long. And so I often say, in any given year, there'll be 5 to 10 countries actually drafting a new constitution. And whereas in the very early era, in the 19th century, everyone was looking to the United States as the sort of source of this new technology, one might say, over time, countries have modernized, I suppose. So if you look at a random constitution produced last year, it doesn't bear much resemblance to that of the United States. And one area where we see that kind of modernization is in rights. So A typical constitution produced now will have all kinds of rights, many more rights than are found in our text, but also...
So we're lagging in some of these areas, you're saying?
Absolutely. In terms of the text, surely. Things like rights to the environment, a right to privacy would now be written into a constitution. And of course, that means in many countries there's debates over rights to sexual freedom or discrimination based on sexual orientation and such.
Interesting. So let's go back to, Jeff, one of the points you made in terms of what you were focusing on in this process of discovery as well as exploration, which is this sort of tension between, do our rights come from we the people, or do our rights come from the Word of God? Is it the Puritan heritage, or is it the founders' attitude? Let's talk a little bit about that issue in the early founding of the United States with regard to how we're not really a Christian nation, but what that role of religion in the public square was like when that document was drafted.
So at the time that the Constitution was adopted, it was again at the height of the Enlightenment, and many of the most prominent Enlightenment thinkers, people like Rousseau and Voltaire and so on, were extremely critical of many of the tenets of Christianity, which they thought were irrational and deprived individuals of freedoms and liberties that were necessary to the pursuit of happiness and that did not serve any legitimate function. And that was deeply built into many of the writings and thinkings of the Enlightenment. The framers of the Constitution were very much a part of that world. People like Washington and Jefferson and Adams and Madison were not practicing Christians in any serious meaning of the word. For the most part, they were much more influenced by the philosophy of deism, which basically took the view that there is a creator, but that creator is not anything like what Judeo-Christian doctrine imagines, that it's not an entity that is attentive to us, that listens to our prayers, and that nothing that creator has done, other than what is sort of built into nature, is directed towards guiding our judgments and values and so on. And so they were very skeptical about religion. At the time the Constitution was adopted, only about 10% of Americans were churchgoers. And one of the reasons they were adamant about adopting in the First Amendment the principle of separation of church and state was because they knew from history that religion could have a very damaging effect upon individual freedom. And they did not want religion to be playing a role that would interfere with, the pursuit of happiness and the ability of individuals to lead their lives as they saw fit. So the notion that religion should dictate the content of the secular law was anathema to the framers. At the same time, they respected the freedom of religion, and they did not want government to prevent people from exercising their own religious beliefs, which is why the First Amendment has both an establishment clause and a free exercise clause. And that was clearly the view of the framers, and the idea of no one used the notion that the nation being created was a Christian nation at the time of the founding. That was completely foreign to anything that they thought. That began to shift in the early years of the 19th century during what was called the Second Great Awakening, when evangelicals began to react to the attitudes and values of the Enlightenment, to the French Revolution, which caused them to have great angst about what freedom could mean and how it could be abused. And that led to the beginnings of what has become a consistent theme in American history of efforts on the part of religious groups to try to essentially take over the secular law. This began with efforts like Sunday closing laws, which were resisted at the time, but the campaign to have Sunday closing laws, the campaign to enforce blasphemy laws in the early 19th century, so those were the early manifestations of this. The first glimmers of laws against obscenity were the early 19th century as a product of this sort of evangelical movement. But this waxed and waned over the past 2 centuries, and we're now living in the midst of the moral majority, which again may seem to us kind of normal, but it's not. There have been these moments in the past, the Second Great Awakening in the beginning of the 19th century, the social purity movement in the late 19th century, where we first adopted laws broadly prohibiting obscenity, prohibiting contraception, prohibiting abortion, all dominated by religious efforts to take over the secular law. And then again now, since 1979, when Jerry Falwell started the moral majority, we've seen this going on again today. But what's interesting about where we are today is much more like where we were at the time of the framing in terms of our attitudes about sexual freedom than was true from the mid-19th century until the mid-20th century.
So I'm going to wait a little bit and then come back to the present time and even looking ahead. But I want to drill down a little bit on what you were saying, Jeff, and then I want to open it up to a broader conversation, because I find it so fascinating that given what you've just described and what the book explicates in a very fascinating way, which is this more Enlightenment imbued founding, it doesn't seem surprising that there would be different religious beliefs there were from the beginning. What seems surprising is, as you say, there's not a kind of natural arc from that to ever increasing tolerance and freedom, but a kind of a swept one way or the other with regard to the effectiveness of the religious use of state authority to impose its beliefs and values on not just its believers, but of citizens. Why do you think that has been able to happen in a constitutional democracy that was founded by people who didn't believe in that, and that is founded on this notion of both pluralism and tolerance? And then, Tom, I want to ask you, because I think we look at places like Turkey and other countries, and this push-pull of, the state imposing what are basically religious values on all citizens is one of the great battles that's going on. So, Jeff?
So one of the reasons it's been able to happen is that in a democracy, the making of the laws is the product of the strength of the convictions of the citizens, the willingness to take serious efforts to bring the law into a conformity with their own beliefs and demands and expectations. And not surprisingly, religious groups, particularly in periods of real religious fervor, are able to bring themselves together, to unite, to be single-issue voters, and to basically take control of the political process. And as I said, that's happened in numerous times in our history. And the real question is, what protects against that, right? Well, one of the fundamental checks against that is, of course, to be the Constitution, which is to say you can't do that. That's not consistent with our Constitution. And so one thing people often ask about is, well, since we do have this establishment clause, which prohibits basically the establishment of religion, which the framers clearly understood to mean that religious organizations and beliefs and groups cannot conscript the secular law to require people who do not share the faith to lead their lives in conformity with a particular religion's beliefs, how come they get away with this all the time? And the answer is that partly justices have not been, at various times in our history, as careful or conscientious in enforcing that. And partly it's because it's actually complicated. Because those people who pursue religious beliefs and want them incorporated into the law understand that they can't say that the law should do this because this is our religious belief. If they say that, then no responsible judge could uphold that as constitutional. But what they do is they basically offer non-religious justifications.
Some social good.
Right, it's for the social good. It's for basic morality. And so, abortion is bad because you're killing a fetus, or homosexuality is bad because it's immoral, and because it debases social culture, and because homosexuals are dangerous people who will go after your children. And so what religious groups have been very clever at doing, or contraception is bad because women can't be trusted with sexual freedom. And if they know they can have sex without getting pregnant, then the Eve-like character of women is going to take hold, and women are going to have extramarital affairs, and so we have to keep them chaste. And one of the ways to keep them chaste is to prevent them from avoiding pregnancy.
After that chastity belt thing didn't work out.
Exactly. So basically what happens is that religious organizations learn how to make arguments for their beliefs in more or less secular terms. And it's very difficult for judges to say, well, the legislature says its reason for doing something is a secular reason, but we know that they're lying. We know that the real reason is religion. And this is a question that runs across constitutional law, but judges generally are very reluctant to call legislatures on their secret motivations for why they adopt things. And that's partly why the courts have been more deferential traditionally than perhaps they should have been. But in the last 60 years, part of what's interesting is we've seen the Supreme Court on all of these different issues taking a much more aggressive stance, not so much by saying you are trying to put religion into the law, even though the justices know that, but by saying these are fundamental freedoms on the part of individuals, the freedom to marry the person you choose, the freedom to control whether to have a child or not, the freedom to read what interests you and what you find stimulating, and that the justifications put forth are not sufficiently weighty to overcome the importance of those individual rights. So the courts almost never, even now, say that law against abortion or contraception or obscenity is unconstitutional because it's based in religion. What they will say is these are fundamental rights and you don't have a good enough reason, and they can't put forth this is our religious belief, because that would clearly be an illegitimate justification for the law.
So Tom, let's talk a little bit about this same dynamic. That is to say, the influence of religious groups within countries, their ability to conscript state authority to impose those beliefs, how courts interpret them, how the Constitution, to your point, which is sometimes more open to change than ours has been. How is that playing out?
Yeah, I think I see things a little bit differently. So there's been a lot of conversation in recent months and years, actually, about kind of democratic backsliding in a number of countries, in Hungary and Poland and Turkey, and populism.
And define
also.
what that is, because I think it's a fascinating concept, and it's not immediately evident what that means.
Right, so I think democratic backsliding would be a reduction in the quality of democracy without overturning it. Not necessarily a coup d'etat where the military takes over, but, decline in people's ability to mobilize, perhaps a dominant
freedom
party.
Of expression.
Right, exactly. Lots of infringements on rights, that particularly those that might be used to help mobilize an opposition. So you get these kind of 1.5 party systems that we see. So there's elections, but they're not really democratic. And it's happening all over. And at the same time, of course, we have this global sort of religious revival. Not just in the Islamic world, but many different faiths are sort of expanding. The way I see it is that the populists use the religious stuff as a way of mobilizing and vaunting themselves into the public consciousness. So it's a little, in my view, there's a little more cynical. It's not religious forces seeking to control the state. It's someone seeing that this is available to them as a way of mobilizing support in order to take state power. And I think that's what we've seen in Turkey. I think we're seeing it in Hungary. I think we're seeing it in Poland. In every one of those countries, sometimes I say it this way, populism's always patriarchal. It always comes with a set of policies that seek to restrict abortion or seek to restore motherhood as kind of the central role of women in society, often accompanied by serious attacks on gay and lesbian individuals, and also repression on speech generally. So it's useful for people.
Yeah. An interesting example of this in the United States, by the way, relates to the issue of abortion. Because if you go back to the late 1960s, Republicans were more pro-abortion than Democrats. And among the governors in the United States who favored laws modernizing the freedom of abortion, allowing the freedom of abortion, people like Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan and Nelson Rockefeller in the 1960s actually supported the liberalization of abortion laws because Republicans were more inclined to be favorable. The primary reason for that on the Democratic side is that most Catholics in the United States were Democrats. And as a consequence, if you looked at polls, the Democrats as a whole were more skeptical about the right of abortion than Republicans were. And one of the things the Republican Party did was, first of all, Richard Nixon figured out that he could use the abortion issue to bring Catholics into the Republican Party. And so in the 1972 election, Nixon, who had traditionally been basically favorable towards abortion, changed his tune and took a strong anti-abortion stance and brought, for the first time in history, large numbers of Catholics into the Republican Party. And then Ronald Reagan did the same thing in the 1980 election with respect to evangelicals, with the birth of the moral majority, which was responsive both to abortion and to the beginning of gay rights and to the women's movement and the Equal Rights Amendment being put out there and changes in the sexual revolution that generated this evangelical backlash, Ronald Reagan figured out that, again, by being anti-abortion and in welcoming the moral majority, he could gain political power, which he did, and that swept him into office in 1980. So this utilization of religious views by politicians has been done very effectively by the Republican Party in the last 60 or 70 years.
It's a kind of an unholy alliance that can be convenient to both of your points in almost any setting, in almost any government. So you have a phrase, Jeff, in the book that I like very much, which is, in the chasm between chastity and reality lies sin and shame. And when I read it, I thought about Kinsey, I thought about Masters and Johnson, I thought about Playboy, I thought about all of those battles. And we've talked a little bit about that, but I'm curious what you think in terms of, in this environment, where, as you say, to a great extent, it mirrors the benefits of the Enlightenment in terms of a sense of greater freedoms and a less willing, both court and society, to accept rationalizations for the suppression of sexual behavior that particularly the capital C Christian Church has stigmatized. Do you think that we are on a path where those rights are permanent, or do you feel that the push-pull that we've seen historically makes us vulnerable going forward?
Oh, I think that we are in the midst of an ongoing push-pull on these issues, most obviously on the issue of abortion. And, with the appointment to the Supreme Court of Neil Gorsuch instead of Merrick Garland, that leaves the court still divided 5-4 in favor of preserving Roe v. Wade. But if Donald Trump gets another appointment to the Supreme Court to replace one of the three oldest justices, Ginsburg, Kennedy, and Breyer, all of whom have been supportive of the right of abortion, and he appoints, as he would, another Gorsuch-type justice, I think there's a very good probability that that group of 5 justices would overrule Roe versus Wade. And so I think this is an ongoing, continuing battle. It's been now really since Ronald Reagan that Republican presidents have been attempting to appoint justices who would overrule Roe versus Wade. 3 of the 7, now 8, they've appointed have disappointed them. Sandra Day O'Connor, Anthony Kennedy, and David Souter, all of whom were appointed in the expectation and the hope that they would vote to overrule Roe v. Wade. But each of them balked at that. And they balked at that partly because of their respect for precedent, partly because they came to understand why this right is so fundamental, why it is so central to a woman's dignity and autonomy and life choices, and also because they came to understand something which had been secret for a long time. In the United States, if you look at the mid-19th century, there were 2 million legal abortions a year. Abortions were legal, they were advertised, there were pills that could be purchased. That did not change until the latter part of the 19th century. But women still got pregnant, and women still did not want children. And even when you get to the 1960s, with much better contraception, there was still 1 million unwanted pregnancies a year resulting in abortion. And these abortions were secret. Because they were illegal and shameful, the women who experienced these could not tell anyone what they had gone through, what they had done. And this became public really for the first time with the women's movement at the end of the 1960s, which encouraged women who had had abortions to speak out and tell their stories. And what they revealed was horrifying. Right? What they revealed was that 300,000 women a year resorted to self-abortion using knitting needles and throwing themselves downstairs. And 2/3 of the million who had abortions used back alley abortionists, which meant being blindfolded and picked up on a corner by people you didn't know and thrown in the back of a car and taken to a location you had no idea where you were, and having people you couldn't see perform an abortion on you, and then throw you back in the car and drop you off in
And
another
sometimes
location.
winding up sterile as a result.
And sometimes winding up dead. There were 200 deaths from illegal abortions a year at that time, and tens of thousands of people who suffered injury because the people doing these abortions were not doctors generally. They were not trained. They could be, elevator operators or electricians or bartenders. And when this came to light, right, when people began to understand what this reality was, people like O'Connor and Souter and Kennedy said, we can't go back there, right? This is a horror. A civilized society should not subject its citizens, and particularly its women, to this kind of reality. And so part of why they chose to stand up to what the people who appointed them expected was that they really understood that that was not an acceptable alternative for our society. But the fact is there are now 4 justices on the Supreme Court who I believe would vote to overrule Roe v. Wade if the occasion presented itself. And with the 5th, I think there's a very good possibility that would happen.
And then it throws it back to the states.
And then it throws it back to the states, and maybe 18 to 20 states would legalize abortion, the blue states, basically, and roughly 30 states, which have tried to adopt all sorts of laws that restrict abortion, even today, which have been forestalled by the Supreme Court intervening, they would no doubt leave abortion illegal. And the consequence of that is hundreds of thousands of women, mostly poor women and minority women, would wind up being back in that world of the back alley abortion and the self-abortion because they couldn't afford to go to other states and pay for legal abortions and so on. But the other thing that's even possible, is worse than that, is it's conceivable that this group of hypothetical 5 justices could not only say that they would overrule Roe v. Wade, but they could say that a fetus is a person.
Right.
Within the meaning of the Constitution, and that it is unconstitutional for a state to allow an abortion, in the same way that it would be unconstitutional for a state to allow a parent to kill a
Infanticide.
2-year-old child because they didn't want it anymore. And it's not inconceivable that group of justices would go that far and therefore outlaw abortion, even in the blue states that wanted to make it legal.
So let's go a little broader than just the discussion we were having about abortion, Tom, and educate us about. We're more familiar with how, as Jeff was talking about, we have a Supreme Court because it's lifetime appointments, because we don't stagger the terms, which some of us think we should. There are these highly, determinative things that can happen that can swing the interpretation of our Constitution in profoundly different directions. How does that play out in other countries? How do courts interpret the constitutions? How are the courts appointed? How can we learn from what, as you were saying before, where maybe other countries are leading, where we think we're always the leader?
Right. Well, I guess one place to start would be Europe. And of course, every country in Europe is embedded in these supranational organizations, not just the European Union, but they're subject to the European Convention on Human Rights, which has its own court. And very much like our Supreme Court is governing 50 states with their own traditions, and they sort of let states do some things, but then, demand uniformity on other issues. The European Court of Human Rights has done the same thing in these areas. And so they tolerate diversity on abortion. In Ireland and Poland, there's very heavy restrictions on abortion. But I think all of those countries allow abortion to save the life of the mother. So there's some convergence there. It's been very interesting to watch it in terms of gay rights, because that's something where the society is moving pretty quickly. And the European Court, very much like our court in like the Brown kind of dynamic, where when there's just a couple of states that are sort of outliers, then the court will step in and demand a uniform rule. But if there's not really a consensus, the European Court, very much like our Supreme Court, is a little more reluctant to come in, and using a doctrine they call the margin of appreciation.
And what does that mean?
That means that the state, as the primary regulator, has its own sort of margin of appreciation. It has its own range of possible interpretations of the convention, which the court will tolerate. And typically what happens is
So a certain deference.
Yes, a deference, exactly.
Okay.
And over time, the court will sometimes restrict that. So actually in the area of gay rights, it's pretty interesting. They have not demanded that all countries have a civil partnership. But if you do have a civil partnership, then it's got to be equally available to homosexuals as well as heterosexuals. They have not demanded that every country, provide for gay marriage, certainly, but they will have a very narrow margin of appreciation when it comes to discrimination against gays and lesbians. So it's a very kind of complex jurisprudence, and it's been very influential. I did want to say something about this. Most countries in the world have constitutional courts that are the primary interpreters of the constitutions. And one of the things that people like me study is the way that doctrines and cases in one country travel abroad. The courts pay attention to what each other are doing. And there's a kind of transnational constitutional dialogue actually about many of these issues. And that actually has come into the United States in the Lawrence case, where Justice Kennedy cited the European Court of Human Rights in his decision. Justice Scalia responds and says, no, this is a Constitution of the United States you are expounding. You shouldn't look abroad. And I think that kind of captures really what's at stake. Are we an open society that's in dialogue with others, or are we closed and it's us and our nation and we're not going to look outside?
We could argue that that has to do with everything from the marketplace of ideas to trade to whether we feel we have a stake in global climate change. There's a whole penumbra of matters that one either sees oneself in the United States as part of a larger planet of societies, countries, and people, or is more isolationist. But I want to go back to something that you alluded to, because I think that would be interesting to explore, which is this idea of influencers, in effect. And who are the influencers? Who are the influencers outside the US? Who are the influencers in the US? If the Supreme Court here, as Jeff was describing, takes this rather dramatic switch, which certainly is eminently possible, does that have a ripple effect on other courts? How do you guys see that dynamic playing out?
Right. Well, I think the United States Supreme Court's role in this transnational dialogue has actually declined over the years, in part because they don't really play the same game as everyone else. And in
They
part
don't engage in the same way.
They don't engage. Justice Kennedy surely does, but the rest of the world is much more comfortable with the idea that they can learn from each other, I suppose, the judges. And of course, the courts are younger and the constitutions are younger, so you can make the case that's not a crazy position. And then, of course, within this world, certain countries are looked to more frequently. Germany is extremely influential. They have very idiosyncratic abortion jurisprudence because of their history. But in other areas, like, if the German Constitutional Court says something, it's usually a very well-reasoned decision and provides sort of a way of thinking about the problem that other judges will then be able to use.
And how long did the justices sit on these other courts?
So in Germany, I believe it's 12 years, I believe. So there's no other country in the world which has true lifetime appointments. Right. A lot of constitutions will say that judges are appointed for life to the Supreme Court, but they always have a retirement age. So in Japan, for example, they're appointed for life, but the average term is 6 years. And from your comment before, I'm with you that I think we ought to adopt a system where maybe it could be very long-term, 12 years, 18.
Right.
But the current system is really dysfunctional, so I'd certainly support a constitutional amendment or an interpretation of the word for life that would allow more reasonable terms.
And is your feeling, Jeff, that that this new court that we're hypothesizing about, for some of the same people who would take us in a different direction in some of these areas of personal freedom and sexual freedom, would also be unlikely to be influenced by what other courts were holding in these matters? What's your feeling about that?
So before I answer that, I just want to say one word about why the framers did life tenure. Because
they only lived to 45 or something, first of all. Let's start with that.
That felt old to them, But I mean, they were this was a very intentional decision. I mean, they wanted judges to be immune from the pressures of majoritarian democracy. They believed in majoritarian democracy, but they feared it. They did not in all ways trust the democracy to act wisely. They knew that people can be bigoted, they can be short-sighted, they can abuse the political power that they have when they take control of all three branches of the government. That's why they had all these checks and balances and the House of Representatives and the Senate, and selected in different ways, and the Electoral College and so on. And one of the things they wanted the courts to do, if they were going to enforce the Constitution, was to basically have independence from majoritarianism. They didn't need to be reelected, they didn't need to be reappointed, they didn't have to think about careers after they were done. They didn't have to care about catering to people to make sure they'd be, hired by big corporations or whatever. They wanted life tenure as a protection to immunize them from all of the forces that might lead them not to do the right thing. So that was the rationale of life tenure. So your question was, right.
Oh,
Right.
go on the
I
record, because you and I have talked about this.
Right.
What do you think about
Right.
lifetime tenure in today's world, having given us that helpful perspective on why back then that was the idea?
I think justices now live too long.
I just want him on the record here.
No, I think they do.
No,
And
no, I know you do.
And I think that they actually should have either some kind of an age retirement or maybe a 27-year term that's rotates so that each president gets several nominations automatically, or even an 18-year term. But the other thing I know about the justices is that they learn during their experience.
Some.
And many of them do learn.
Many.
And
I go with many.
And the ones who learn almost always become better justices. And I think we don't want to lose the benefit of that experience. They become wiser, they have a better appreciation of the responsibility of the court, of the complexities of society that require the court to play a certain role. And so I do think that if you shorten the terms too much, you will lose many of the wiser decisions that these justices move to. On the question you asked about, though, which was looking to the, right.
Yeah.
So if you are an originalist, right, the way, say, Justice Scalia says he is, or the way, or said he was, or the way Justice Thomas says he is, or the way Neil Gorsuch seems to think he is, then of course what happens internationally is irrelevant. It's completely irrelevant. All that matters is what these people 200 years ago did and intended. And that's all you look at. You don't look at changes in our society, let alone what's happening in Germany or Japan. That's completely irrelevant to what the framers themselves intended 200 years ago. And so for originalists, all of this stuff is completely irrelevant and nonsense and discordant with any principled theory of constitutional interpretation. So if you are an originalist, it's easy to see why they completely dismiss this as irrelevant. The justices who do look more broadly at what happens in social movements in the United States, in social change, and in what happens in the world, is they are looking to have an understanding of how to think about this question of unenumerated rights. This question about how do we understand the aspirations of the framers, not by locking ourselves into what they themselves understood and intended 200 years ago, which, by the way, the framers themselves would have rejected entirely as a method of constitutional interpretation, because that's not what they wanted judges to do. But if your view is we want to have a fuller, better understanding of what freedom of speech is, about what equality is, about what unenumerated rights are, what privacy is, then to do that you have to look at the changes not only in your own society but around the world. Mm-hmm. And that helps to inform the values and judgments of the justices.
Let's go back a little bit. We touched on this earlier in terms of this strong relationship, which really is an important subject that you mine in the book, Jeff, of the influence of religion even in ostensibly secular societies. And as you've talked about, Tom, it's also, we're seeing this not just in the United States. So one of the ways that plays itself out that I've always found interesting is this sort of, I would characterize it as fine line, let's say, between blasphemy and obscenity. And, in a Charlie Hebdo world, I go back to thinking about Lenny Bruce, who was busted for obscenity, but most people would say it was actually that he was taking on the church. How do you see that playing itself out? And do you think in that regard, that is to say, sort of the freedom of expression aspects of things, as opposed to abortion and gay rights, do you feel that those battles are permanently won? And then, for both of you, I also want you to talk a little bit about, in an environment in which we started with the idea of local community standards, but we now live in an interconnected world through technology, how does that play itself out in terms of how does any society or even a country determine what it finds permissible speech when its citizens can access speech from all over?
Well, the Supreme Court has held that laws against blasphemy are per se unconstitutional. They violate the Establishment Clause and the Free Speech Clause. And I don't know that we won't have a time with, the moral majority and a Supreme Court that would change that doctrine. It's not inconceivable. With respect to obscenity, it's a little harder for the reasons you suggest, because basically what happened with obscenity is that initially there were no laws against obscenity, and there was really extremely explicit material circulating all over the world and in England and the United States. It was during as I said, the Second Great Awakening that the first laws against obscenity first came into being in the latter part of the 19th century, as led by Anthony Comstock. Eventually, all states in the nation adopted obscenity laws, and they were severe. I mean, you could not talk about sex. It wasn't about showing naked people of people having sex. You could not talk about sex. Even in medical journals, you could not talk about sex. That's how extreme the laws were. And they began to be pushed back against them during the 20th century. But the Supreme Court always assumed that something called obscenity was not protected by the First Amendment. And the question was, well, what is obscenity? How do you define it? And the court first began looking at that in 1957 when it first addressed the question of what obscenity is. And it then ran into this period of years when it was almost impossible to define. And Justice Stewart famously said, I don't know how to define it, but I know it when I see it, which is not very helpful, right? And when Warren Burger was appointed to the Supreme Court and the Burger Court came into being, one of his highest priorities was to adopt a real defined definition of obscenity, tighten up that definition, because in the 60s, sexually related expression had become much more widespread to the horror of people like Warren Burger. And the idea was to redefine obscenity in a way that would be enforceable and much stricter. And they did that. But what's happened over the years is technology has simply swallowed the concept. The practical reality, particularly with the internet, is that it is impossible for the government to prevent consenting adults from having access to this kind of material. I mean, there's literally no way for the government to do that, short of completely taking over the internet and banning all sorts of websites from foreign countries, and nobody
total Big Brother.
Right, and nobody seems to be in favor of that. So basically, the idea of regulating obscenity in that context has disappeared, and no state and the federal government devotes any appreciable resources anymore to trying to ferret out and punish obscenity. What they've done instead is to focus on a couple of things. They've tried to some degree to continue to protect children from access to obscenity, but even that's become almost impossible given the internet. So you can still make it a crime to sell a dirty book to a 12-year-old in a bookstore, and you can still make it a crime to allow a 12-year-old to go into an X-rated movie, but that same 12-year-old can go on the internet and basically find whatever they want unless their parent puts a filter on the internet, and they don't work very well. So what instead everyone is now focused on is child pornography. And child pornography basically means that using a real child to engage in sexual conduct in order to make a video that is then essentially put on the internet and sold and made available to people. And there, the court has held you can't punish that, not because the video itself is harmful any more than obscenity is harmful, but because they want to try to take away the incentive to sexually abuse these children in the making of this material. And so that's where basically all of the resources are now devoted. And I rather doubt that's going to change in the foreseeable future. I think the technology here has simply completely swamped the capacity of government to regulate obscenity. The only other area in which it's regulated is in public. So if somebody wanted to put up a billboard that showed two people having anal intercourse, completely naked, very explicit, repeated over and over again every 5 minutes, that could be banned because it would deal with children and non-consenting adults. But short of that, basically the government's given up. And
what's happening in that regard, Tom?
Right, so the United States is really pretty distinctive, actually, in the scope of our First Amendment. So for example, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights actually requires states to ban hateful or insightful speech against various categories. And in the United States, well, we allow that. Right. And I think the way I see this whole area is that we're an outlier. We have really no law. We really mean no law. And with technology, we've essentially exported that to the rest of the world because through the internet you can find hateful speech against whatever group you want, and indeed it may encourage that. And so. So this is an area where I think that technology is challenging a lot of different countries in their ability to keep things under control. The way I read your story, which I thought was fascinating, is sort of society and technology overcoming the law. The law was unable to stop or to really come up with a
Couldn't catch
conceptual
up.
framework.
Right.
They just couldn't get their heads around it, and the society sort of swept right by them. I think we're seeing the same thing with regard to a lot of these issues, but it's not such a happy story in areas like blasphemy, for example. Pakistan has blasphemy laws, and sometimes just the other week,
Yes.
a group took their enforcement of that rule in their own hands and lynched someone. It happens in Afghanistan periodically as well. So the idea that the government can't really get this right, they tend to overreach or somehow blow it, and really, it can then be used again by groups or malicious groups in society to empower themselves in very nasty ways.
Try and maintain control.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to be able to allow time for questions, so let me ask both of our panelists just one final question, and I'll start with you, Tom, which is thinking about everything that we've talked about and everything that sort of relates to these subjects. What are you most worried about, and what are you most optimistic about?
It's a great question. Well, one thing again, this from a transnational perspective, I think, we really are in a global environment. One of the things we see is that groups that are organized here, if they don't succeed in the United States, well, then they tend to bring their efforts abroad. We've seen lobbying by various anti-gay groups or anti-abortion groups all over the world.
Yes.
And that's changing those societies too. So we really are in this kind of global conversation. And I worry that could be particularly bad in the area of reproductive freedom. I think that's the number one issue where I see things really going quite badly in many, many countries. It's not clear, in other words, that there's a dynamic where the society is going to continue to evolve,
Automatically, yeah.
which I think might be more true in the area of gay rights.
And what are you most optimistic about?
What am I most optimistic about? Well, I tend to be an optimistic person, so I'm trying to find something. I mean, I do think that the society is, I see it in terms of generational change even in the United States. When you talk to our students, for example, about, gay rights, certainly, they really, it's not an issue.
Right.
They just accept that this is where we're going. So I think on that issue, the arc of history is long, and there's a lot of setbacks in a lot of countries. But I'm pretty confident that the history is going to continue to move forward rapidly in that area.
Great. Jeff?
I actually have the same answer. I mean, I think that looking at it from the United States perspective, I think the area I'm most concerned about, as I've made clear, is reproductive choice. I do think that there are powerful movements in this country that are fiercely determined to prevent that choice. And by the way, I understand why people who hold that view are so fierce about it. I mean, if you believe, truly, deeply, sincerely believe that a fetus is no different than a 2-year-old child, then it's easy to understand why this is not something you're going to give up on. In the same way that most of us would be horrified by a law that allowed a parent to murder a 2-year-old child if they decided they didn't want it after all. For those people who truly believe this, I understand why they feel as fiercely as they do. I think they should keep their religious beliefs to themselves and not try to impose it on anybody else, but I do understand why, if they believe this is not going to go away. And I do think that the Supreme Court has played a critical role here. I think that the Supreme Court, if it changes the makeup in this way, will finally turn this around in ways that I think are very dangerous and destructive. I also agree that on the gay rights issue, I'm much more optimistic. I think that the changes in society with respect to gay rights have been different. That is, those people who regard sodomy as evil and regard gays and lesbians as horrible, dangerous, immoral individuals.
Or even the other.
Right. They feel that much less intensely than they did 30 or 40 years ago. One of the things that the AIDS crisis did is to force gays out of the closet. And so, like the story about abortion, we didn't know we knew gay people. We all knew lots of people who were gay 30 years ago, but didn't know it. And now, largely because of the effect of the AIDS crisis, people could no longer maintain their secrecy. They were forced to reveal to their parents and their children and their friends and their employers and their neighbors that they were gay because they were sick and they were dying. And suddenly people realized that they knew these people and they loved them and they cared about them. And that had a profound impact on social attitudes about homosexuality. And I think that even though there is still obviously a core group of people in the United States who feels this is evil and immoral, it's not like anti-abortion. It's not like these people are killing other people. And so I think that on that issue, we will not see the kind of reversion that we will potentially see on the reproductive rights issue. And so I'm cautiously optimistic about that.
While Neve comes up to take questions from the audience, please join me in thanking Jeff and Tom.
Great, thanks Christy, and thanks everyone. We'll go out to you now for your questions, if you wouldn't mind raising your arm and waiting for a mic and making sure it's a question. Yeah, let's start off with the lady right here in the middle.
So when we're talking about sex in the Constitution, the Equal Rights Amendment comes to mind. 2 questions. Is that deader than a doornail? And what difference would it make for a lot of these other questions, not least abortion, but others, were it to become part of the Constitution?
So, some of you will recall, many of you will recall, when the Equal Rights Amendment was proposed, it was endorsed by almost the entire House and Senate. The assumption was that it would be adopted effortlessly and quickly. This is part of what led to the pushback that culminated in the creation of the moral majority. And to the shock of most people, the Equal Rights Amendment failed. They could not obtain ratification in the requisite number of states.
We live in the northernmost state that didn't ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, just saying.
Interesting.
And the Equal Rights Amendment is dead. That amendment that had been initially proposed by the Congress. Someone could put up another Equal Rights Amendment at some point. But again, you need the 3/4 of the states. And I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. Things have gotten worse than they were on these issues than they were in the early 1970s. It's interesting that at the time Roe v. Wade was decided, I was a law clerk that year for Justice Brennan. And one of the criticisms that some people have lodged against Roe v. Wade is that instead of relying upon the right of privacy of the woman to control her own reproductive processes, the court should have regarded laws against abortion as discrimination against women and as violating the Equal Protection Clause. And at that time, the court was not prepared to go there. It was prepared to recognize in a 7-2 decision a right to abortion, right, including 3 of Nixon's 4 nominees supported the right to abortion. But it wasn't prepared to go there. And one of the reasons it wasn't prepared to go there was because the Equal Rights Amendment was then pending before the states, and the justices assumed it was going to get ratified, and they didn't want to interfere with that process by preempting it, in effect, by interpreting the Equal Protection Clause as mooting the Equal Rights Amendment. So for that reason, they refused to recognize that discrimination against women was constitutionally suspect in the same way that state discrimination against African Americans was, which is what the Equal Rights Amendment meant to do. Now, in fact, over time, the court has come more or less to that position. Over time, the court has basically embraced the view that laws that discriminate on the basis of sex are presumptively unconstitutional, and therefore almost any law that explicitly discriminates against women will in fact be held unconstitutional today, even without the Equal Rights Amendment.
Great, next question, please. Yes, the lady right there in the middle, please. The mic is on your other side.
If you could write your own constitution, what amendment would you include?
In the American one?
Yeah, the American one.
Yeah. Why don't you take
I think
that
you
first,
should
Ed?
both answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You first.
Only
Ed.
Democrats get to vote.
Again, to remind you of our disclaimer from earlier tonight.
If it was a single
It's a
amendment,
very bipartisan panel.
if it was a single amendment, I would have an amendment that overruled Citizens United. 80% of the American people believe Citizens United was wrongly decided. It was wrongly decided. It was a terrible decision. It's had an extraordinarily corrupting influence on American politics, and that influence will only grow over time. So if there was a single amendment directed to a particular question, that's the amendment I would support.
Yeah.
Tom?
I think I would probably get rid of the Electoral College, and I say that independent of the partisan configuration of the last, two of the last 4 elections. It's got certain advantages actually, which are often underappreciated, but it's also quite problematic. I think we ought to. I would consider that maybe we ought to consider having a parliamentary system. I think it'd be a lot better for minorities and regional interests and genuine interests which are really shut out no matter what kind of system we have when it's a 2-party electoral college dominated system. And I think there's no reason we ought not to consider something like that.
And I would have a democracy agenda that combined ending gerrymandering, public financing, and robust voter rights.
Great. I've got the top question that we have from our online people coming in. The number one question people are interested in an answer from the panel is, what can individuals do to stem the encroachment of religion into law and politics?
Well, the key place in which it happens, of course, is in the legislature, and organizing politically to develop a force that is a counterweight to the religious right, basically, is a challenge. And we've seen, since the election, we've seen some pushbacks in this way. But I think it has to be as organized, as concerted, and as committed as religious believers are. And that's not so easy to do, because the truth is one of the reasons why religious groups tend to have the impact they do is because they're willing to be single-issue voters, right? They're willing to say, if you do not vote to criminalize abortion, I will vote against you no matter what. I don't care about anything else. I don't care about war. I don't care about the economy. I don't care about anything. That's the only issue. And that single-issue voters have an enormous impact on politicians. Now, it's not healthy for democracy for people to do that, but they do, and it matters. And I think that on the other side, we've not been very effective at marshaling ourselves in a way that counteracts the effectiveness of, again, to come back to the moral majority, which has been extremely effective at doing this.
I would just say that I absolutely agree with what Jeff said, but embedded in that is the more simple idea of simply voting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have about 30% of eligible voters who vote in primaries, which is what determines who you can vote for in general elections. And if I were queen for a day, I would also go with the Australian system and make voting a legal requirement. But until and unless we do that, if you want to have an influence, then you need to organize people to actually be willing to vote.
I don't have much to add. I think that's absolutely right. It's pretty simple. Vote, call your congressman. That's what we are able to do in this country.
Did you know, Tom, though, from any of your international work, of any successful examples of civil society being able to kind of stop this encroachment?
Well, it's interesting. It's hard to, so there's 2 points. First of all, in many societies, there is this rising religious force, and it's, I suppose, asymmetric. It's really hard for anti-religious people to have the same fervor as religious people about issues. It's also often the case that, the religious forces are able to mobilize around a single thing that they really, really want. In our country, the Supreme Court is asymmetrically a religious issue. It's the counter forces just don't care that much. They care about a lot of other things too, and so it's not. That's why it's important that it's not be a partisan battleground. If you're interested in the politics that you were articulating, so that's a major force that I think we see going on all around the world. The other thing is that there's transnational mobilization, as I mentioned before. There really are transnational organizations going around and saying, they showed up, for example, in Kenya when I was doing some work there, and in South Sudan, and saying, we really think it's important that you reiterate that abortion not be available in your constitution. And so,
or gay rights.
Or gay rights, particularly, it's a major issue in Africa and such. And so, constitutions are like other legislation. People lobby about them. It would be, and I don't think there's a counterforce. I don't think there's a counterforce going around saying, this should be left to the local people, or they're making the powerful
fundamental
argument
right.
for the separation of church and state in a transnational context.
That's an interesting point.
Thanks.
Yeah, next question. Right there, please, in the fifth row from the back. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you could comment on the proposed repeal or the implications of the proposed repeal of the Johnson Amendment.
What's the Johnson Amendment?
Nonprofits to get involved in the political process and advocate for candidates.
I tend to think that we don't want those kinds of organizations getting involved in politics. I think that there are real dangers there, and I don't know which way they would cut, but I tend to think that individuals should be being involved in politics, but that corporations, nonprofits, and so on should not. The problem with it is if you make it nonprofit, then it's basically government money being used through the nonprofit status to support politics. And that distorts the process by which the government decides which nonprofits are going to get money. So if you allow nonprofits to basically use their status, then I don't trust government officials not to manipulate which nonprofits are going to get those monies, because they'll give them to those that basically wind up supporting them. So that's the problem, is you then have, a Republican House and Senate will start giving more money to those nonprofits that support them politically. And that's the danger I would worry a lot about.
I frankly disagree. I don't think it's that big a deal, actually, because it's impossible to regulate. It's, you kind of can guess from the nature of the nonprofit and its mission which side it's on. So now we require them organizing around issues rather than candidates, but it's a pretty thin line. It's true, the preacher cannot get up and say vote for Trump or vote for Clinton, but they can come pretty close and not cross the line, and I don't think it's really hard to get that line right, so it doesn't concern me as much.
Okay, next question. Yes, I see a hand there, second to the back, second row from the back, Andrew. Oh, sorry, and then I'll get you next, okay? Yeah.
How about private censorship? For example, Google has a very strict family-friendly requirement for accepting advertising through their AdSense program. The requirements are almost back to the standards and practices guidelines of the 1960s.
So the Constitution applies only to government and government entities. So private entities are not subject to any of the requirements that the Constitution imposes on government. So the question then is whether legislation should be enacted that regulates the decisions of private entities in their decisions about what they wish to carry. So for example, with newspapers, right, basically they are free to decide for themselves whether they wish or don't wish to carry particular op-eds or particular advertisements. Right. So the Chicago Tribune or the New York Times can decide what letters to the editor it will publish and what ones it won't publish.
And then it won't take gun advertisements.
Right, it won't take gun advertisements, it won't take pro-abortion advertisements, whatever. They're perfectly free, indeed within their own First Amendment rights, to be free of government intervention that requires them to allow messages to be communicated in their speech that they don't approve of, right? Now, there are limitations on that principle. So, for example, with respect to over-the-air broadcasting, ABC, NBC, CBS, PBS, and radio, government has long regulated them on the theory that over-the-air broadcasting is using public property. That is, the airwaves were perceived to be public property, and therefore the government could appropriately regulate it. But other than that, the general assumption has been a great degree of distrust in allowing the government to interfere in the freedom of private enterprise in deciding what speech it will and will not endorse or carry. And the disadvantage of allowing the government to regulate that is, do you trust the government? Right? Because if the government gets its hands on that, it may not do so in a way that you and I might think to be in the interest of the nation. So that's the challenge. On the one hand, you have these enterprises now that have enormous power, like Google, for example, far greater power than any media enterprise ever had in history. And that's dangerous because they can then manipulate themselves, right? What speech they will allow and what speech they won't allow. And that's problematic. But on the other hand, to allow the government to do it has a different set of dangers. So my own sense is that there is a point at which it may become necessary and appropriate for government to begin prohibiting private enterprise to discriminate against certain types of ideas. But it's a dangerous road to go down because they won't always do it the way you and I might like.
You know, this is an area actually where the reverse dynamic that I was referring to before has kind of occurred. Because remember before I said that in Europe, many countries have rules against hate speech and incitement, and they do have content-based restrictions. And they will make Google and Yahoo and et cetera abide by those. And, you know, at some point, if those restrictions...
And newspapers as well.
Right, exactly. And if at some point, if those restrictions were severe enough or imposed enough costs, Google would just adopt them globally, probably. So this may be an area where we are subject to externalities that flow.
It's like the old successful effort of restricting within Texas what textbooks could carry in terms of evolution and other hot-button issues, knowing that Texas was a big enough market that the book publishers would not produce a separate edition for Texas, and it became then national law, and it's one of the things that drove the founding of People for the American Way, that understood you had to actually get in front of the local school boards that were setting these standards, or you would wind up with the kind of lowest common denominator.
This is what Facebook does too. I mean, Facebook now, because it's international, and it has no desire or capacity to separate what someone posts on Facebook in France from what they post in Mexico from what they post in the United States. They basically can't violate the law of those states that have the most severe laws. So there's all sorts of things that Facebook tries to take down in order to be consistent with the laws in other countries that interfere with your freedom of speech. And that's part of the complexity of having this international platform now.
Thanks. The gentleman right here, please.
So earlier in the talk, when you mentioned child pornography, it reminded me of an article I'd read, an anonymous article by a school teacher that admittedly struggled with pedophilia. And the person said, you know, I recognize this is wrong. I don't act on it, but if I were to come out, I would lose my job and there'd be all sorts of social repercussions. So my question is just, has there been anywhere, either historically or in other parts of the globe, where they're looking at this problem in an effective way and taking a different approach, or are those people kind of destined to always be kind of hidden and on the fringes of society?
And by those people, you mean child pornography people, pedophiles?
People who struggle with that, maybe they act on it, maybe they do not.
Well, so I'll say something first. You know, so obviously it is a global issue. You know, we're actually seeing what I would consider some regression on that. Erdogan, who's just won this major constitutional reform in Turkey last year, proposed...
Reform.
Yes, right. Last year proposed actually a loosening up of the child rape laws in Turkey, such that if the perpetrator married the victim, they would not be prosecuted. And we are seeing there's a pushback because, of course, in the Islamic world in particular, because of the Quranic, evidence about the age of child marriage. Some people take that as exemplary practice or some such thing, and so they certainly would not tolerate restrictions on it. A lot of countries are grappling with how to deal with that, and in Turkey, it's actually a pretty common phenomenon in the most conservative parts of the country. Child marriage. Now, that might be different than pedophilia per se, but it's not an area where there's any kind of global consensus in practice, that's for sure.
One of the interesting questions about pedophilia, by the way, is that is our attitude towards it, in fact, rational? Or is it completely the product of religious indoctrination? That is it so obvious that for a child to have sex with an adult is harmful to the child? I mean, we've all come to buy into that, but is it in fact true? The Greeks had a practice of pederasty that was widely practiced and regarded as admirable. It involved post-adolescent young people, boys, but they were still clearly what we would regard as children, and they frequently had sex with adult men, and this was regarded as an admirable form of relationship. partly because it was seen as a way that you would mentor young boys, that you'd have a relationship with them of caring and love and affection, and that this was, even though it included sexual aspects, this was simply a way of socializing people into becoming grown-ups. And indeed, it was also seen as admirable because there was a sense that, as it was put, if you want to love truly, you have to love another man, because women are not worthy of your love. But the point is, that was a society that we generally tend to admire and respect, and yet pederasty was a widespread and admired way of relating to things. So I'm not advocating pedophilia here, but I do think one has to wonder, why are we so hung up on it, right? Why is it really so terrible? If it's done in a kind and gentle way, why do we think that this is a horrible thing? Is it so obvious?
Well, I think the presumption is there's an inherent imbalance of ability to make an informed decision and empower. And you know this from being in it.
We make all sorts of decisions for children all the time, precisely for that reason.
Well, that may be true. I was going to go to the extension of it, as you know, in an academic setting, which is, forget a 15-year-old, it's the teacher-student relationship, which is generally not permissible in most universities, because the presumption is, even if it's a 18-year-old student, that there's an imbalance of power that inherently makes the relationship suspect.
Yeah, and I think we've adopted that notion, and I think there's a concern about power, but it's not obvious that the revulsion we feel about that is actually rational. I know lots of women students who've said to me, this is crazy, right? I mean, but why do you think I can't have a relationship with someone who happens to be...
These are women students interested in dating you.
No.
It's all right.
Nice. I mean, they feel...
Jane has a wonderful significant other. I just put that out there.
They feel it's patronizing to them.
Yeah,
right?
And there is some of that.
Right.
It's kind of
but basically, I'm not actually advocating that we should... But the truth is, we rethought homosexuality, right? Which most people thought was evil and morally reprehensible. And, maybe we should rethink pedophilia. Maybe that's just a product of religion, too.
Okay, well, there's probably lots more
the
about
crowd
it in
is
the book.
turning.
We're 1 minute over, but please join me in thanking Judicial.
On that note.
Thank you. Good night.